My name is James. I was just an ordinary guy trying to make a living. I came from a small town, far from the city lights. It wasn't glamorous, but it was simple, and I liked it that way. I never thought I'd end up working at a place like this, a theme park that no one really talks about. But I guess that's where fate led me. It was a strange decision, really. I never imagined I'd be the kind of person to work at a theme park, especially one with a reputation that no one would speak of openly. I was always just doing my job, keeping to myself. No one at the park seemed to last long. The ones who stayed, they just weren't the same. And no one, not a single person, would ever tell me why. The first day I set foot in the park, I was struck by how quiet it was. Sure, there were people scattered about, the occasional family, a couple of teenagers trying to sneak on the rides, but there was this odd silence hanging in the air, like the whole place was waiting for something. The smell of stale popcorn and cheap cotton candy didn't help the atmosphere either. But what struck me the most wasn't the way the park looked. It was the people. Everyone seemed off. I can't put my finger on it, but something was wrong. The manager, an older guy named Rick, gave me a rundown of the basics. Work the rides, make sure no one gets hurt, and if anything goes wrong, don't try to fix it. Just call the supervisor. Simple enough, right? Well, it wasn't until later that day when I heard the first rule. I was taking a break in the staff lounge, just scrolling through my phone when I overheard a couple of employees talking. One of them, a guy named Carl, was saying something under his breath, almost like a prayer. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard him mention something about the ride stations and after dark. I leaned in a little, trying not to make it obvious that I was eavesdropping. "Can't be too careful after dark," Carl said. "The rule says you're not supposed to go near the ride stations once the sun goes down. Not unless you want to end up like last year's guy." I didn't know who this last year's guy was, but the fear in Carl's voice was enough to send a chill down my spine. I figured it was just another one of those weird park rumors, something to scare off the new guys, but I should have taken it seriously. That night, things were about to change for me. I was assigned the late-night shift to monitor one of the older rides. Nothing fancy, just a basic Ferris wheel near the back of the park. It wasn't until around 11 p.m. that I started hearing things. Soft murmurs, faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the sound of machinery creaking in the distance. But then, I saw someone moving around the ride station. I thought it was just another employee, maybe someone from maintenance. But when I walked closer, I saw nothing. The ride station was empty. I double-checked my flashlight and walked back, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, too heavy to be the wind. I spun around, my flashlight beam flickering, and that's when I saw him. A figure, standing in the doorway of the ride station. The light was dim, but I could make out his silhouette. He didn't look like a staff member. There was something wrong about him. I didn't know it then, but I should have followed the first rule I heard. The one I should have paid attention to. It was only when I got closer that I saw his eyes. Black as night, soulless. He didn't blink, didn't move. Just stared at me. I froze. The rules had said nothing about guests sneaking around, but this felt different. It felt wrong. And in that moment, I remembered something Carl had whispered earlier, something about the ride stations after dark. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but standing there, staring into those black eyes, I suddenly understood. The first rule wasn't just some idle precaution. It was a warning, and I had ignored it. I didn't get a chance to do anything before the alarms went off. Lights flashed, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. The figure in the doorway was gone, and the station was completely empty. But the feeling I had, the cold fear that settled in my stomach, never went away. After that night, I kept to myself. I did my job, kept my head down, and tried to forget what had happened. But the strange feeling didn't go away. Every time I walked past the ride stations, I kept my eyes peeled, just waiting for that same figure to reappear. I didn't talk to anyone about it, partly because I was still trying to figure it out, but mostly because I knew no one would believe me. After all, who would? But I wasn't the only one who had a story to tell. That's when I started hearing more about the rules, real rules, not the kind you find on the staff handbook. The kind they don't tell you when you sign up, but you learn by experience. It was my second week on the job, and I had been assigned to close up the park for the night. It was after midnight, and I was finishing my last patrol when I noticed something odd. The lights started flickering. At first, I thought it was just the usual glitch in the system. You know, the kind of thing that happens when you work late. But then, I saw something I couldn't ignore. The Ferris wheel, the same one I'd been watching earlier, started moving on its own. No one was riding it. No one was operating it. But it moved slowly at first, then faster, until it was spinning wildly in place. I remember thinking I should call someone from maintenance, maybe, but the thought didn't reach me in time. The lights flickered once more, and everything fell silent. That's when I remembered the second rule. Never stay in the park after the lights flicker. I don't know how I knew it, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no one around, but I knew the park wasn't as empty as it seemed. It wasn't until after the lights went out completely that I heard it. The whispers. Low, deep, coming from all directions. It felt like the walls of the park were closing in on me, and I realized then that the rules weren't just for keeping things orderly. They were there for something else. Something darker. I ran back to the staff entrance, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. The Ferris wheel had stopped spinning, but I could still hear the whispers echoing in my head. I didn't know what they were, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out. The next few days felt off. I kept replaying everything in my head. The figure in the doorway, the flickering lights, the whispers. No matter how hard I tried to brush it off, it stayed with me. I had to work my way through it because, well, I had a job to do. But something told me I wasn't going to get through this unscathed. It was the weekend when things really started to spiral. I was working the night shift again, this time patrolling near the haunted house attraction. There was something about that place that always gave me the creeps. It wasn't the decor or the screams from the riders. No, it was the fact that there was no one running it after hours. No lights, no staff, just the sound of wind howling through the empty halls. I took my route and made my way toward the house. That's when I saw it, a shadow darting across the window at the front of the house. It moved too fast to be a person, but I couldn't tell what it was. I decided to check it out, thinking it was probably just some stupid prank, maybe another employee messing around after hours. I wasn't going to let something so trivial get to me. I walked inside the entrance, and I immediately felt the temperature drop. It wasn't just colder, it was unnatural. As I walked deeper into the house, the lights flickered on and off. One moment, I could barely see, and the next, the hallway was lit up like it was midday. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. But what happened next is when I really started to understand the truth about this place. I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, like someone following my every move. I spun around, expecting to see someone there. But no one was there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from something unexpected. No, this was something deeper, something older. That's when I remembered the rule. Rule 3. Never turn your back on the dark corners of the park. It sounds simple, right? Like something they'd put in a rule book just to keep people safe. But in that moment, I understood why it was a rule. The shadowy corners, the places where the light doesn't reach, they weren't just dark. They were dangerous. They hid things that could follow you, could stalk you in ways you couldn't even imagine. I backed away from the hallway, feeling my pulse race. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. But before I could turn to run, the room went dark, completely black. No flicker, no warning. Just darkness. And then, from that void, came the whispers again. This time, they were louder. They were close. I spun around again, but there was nothing in sight. I had to get out. I didn't look back, not once, until I reached the exit. When I burst out of the haunted house, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face. I didn't know how long I had been inside, but it felt like hours. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't. The whispers lingered in my mind. It was like they were waiting for me, watching me. The worst part was I knew the rules by now. They weren't meant to protect me. They were meant to keep whatever was out there contained. And I had crossed a line. The next few days blurred into a haze of confusion and dread. I couldn't shake what I had seen, heard, and felt in that haunted house. It stayed with me night after night. I had heard the rumors, of course. The place had a dark history, but hearing it was different from experiencing it. One night, I decided to confront Rick, the manager. I didn't care anymore. I needed answers, even if they scared the hell out of me. I found him in his office, sitting behind his desk as usual. When I knocked, he looked up at me, but there was something strange about his expression, like he had been expecting me. "What's on your mind, James?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. I hesitated, but then I blurted it out. "I've seen things, heard things. What's going on here? What's really happening at this park?" Rick's eyes flickered briefly, almost imperceptibly. Then, without warning, he stood up and locked the door behind me. I felt my heart race as I realized I wasn't getting out of here without some answers. "You don't want to know," Rick said quietly. "But since you're asking, I'll tell you. But you need to understand. Once you know, there's no going back." He sat back down, and I took a seat across from him. The tension in the room was thick, like the air itself was waiting for him to speak. "This park," he started slowly, "was built on something ancient. Something that's been here long before we ever arrived. It was meant to be a place of joy, of happiness, but that's not what it really is. It's a trap." I didn't understand at first. A trap? For who? For what? Rick continued. "The park's rules, they're not just for safety. They're to contain what's here. What's been here since before the park even existed. You saw it, didn't you? The figure, the shadows, the whispers. Those aren't just ghosts. They're something else." It was then that he dropped the bombshell. Rule 4, never break the cycle. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The park runs in cycles, seasonally, yearly. But once the cycle's broken, it doesn't stop. The park feeds on people like us. People who break the rules. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't process it all. My mind was racing, but Rick wasn't done. "You need to leave. Tonight. Before it's too late," he said urgently. "Because once you start seeing the signs, it's already too late." As he spoke those words, the lights in the office flickered. And just like that, I knew he wasn't lying. The darkness was closing in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Rick had said. The park feeds on people like us. The cycle. It was too much to process all at once, but somehow, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The whispers were still there, lingering in my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push them out. The lights flickered again that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. The next shift felt different, more intense. As I walked the perimeter, checking the gates and the closed rides, I couldn't help but feel like the park itself was alive. The silence was oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I had heard the stories, the ones that said the park was built on ancient grounds, but hearing them from Rick, seeing his fear, made everything hit harder. There was something here, something dark, and I wasn't sure I was going to make it out. I moved toward the roller coaster, one of the biggest attractions, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows of the ride's structure. I froze. It was tall, with long, thin limbs, and its face was obscured by something, like it was wearing a mask made of darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't human. I had a sudden urge to run, but I didn't. I couldn't move. The figure seemed to be watching me, and then, just like that, it was gone. Disappeared into the darkness. And that's when I remembered the next rule. Rule 5, never stand still in the dark. It sounds harmless enough, right? Just keep moving, stay alert. But in that moment, I understood what it really meant. Standing still in the dark, waiting for something to happen, is exactly what the park wants. It lures you in, traps you in its shadow. The figure I saw, I wasn't the first to see it, and I wouldn't be the last. I took a few shaky steps back, trying to steady my breathing. The hairs on my neck were standing on end. I had to leave, had to move, or it would be too late. But as I turned, I heard something behind me, soft footsteps, almost like they were following me. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. But I couldn't help myself. I spun around, but there was nothing. The darkness was absolute, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I had crossed a line, and I was starting to feel the weight of that. Days turned into weeks, and the unease only grew. I didn't trust my own mind anymore. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, and I was starting to lose track of what was real. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. The whispers were always there. And the rules, they kept coming back to me. Every time I tried to do something normal, I'd remember a rule I had broken. I went to Rick again. This time I was desperate. I needed answers, real answers. But when I found him, he was different. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in days. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. "You've been breaking the rules, haven't you?" he asked quietly, almost like he already knew. I didn't answer. I couldn't. It was true. I had broken so many rules, and the consequences were already starting to show. Rick sighed. "I told you to leave. But you're not going to, are you?" His voice was filled with regret. "The park gets to you, James. It gets inside your head. Once you start seeing the things I saw, hearing the whispers, it's too late." I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. But I couldn't. There was something about the way he was talking that made it feel like we were both already doomed. We weren't in control anymore. The park was. Then, Rick looked at me with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "You've seen the shadows, haven't you? The ones that follow you? They've already marked you. You can't escape them." That's when I understood. The park wasn't just a place. It was a living entity. It fed on fear, on the people who worked there. And once it latched on, there was no getting away. Rick turned away, his voice almost a whisper. "Rule 6, never let the park mark you." I didn't fully understand it then, but now I know. The shadows, the figures I kept seeing, they weren't random. They were a sign. The park had claimed me, just like it had claimed Rick. And I was no longer just a witness. I was part of the cycle now. And the cycle never ends. As I stood there, staring at Rick, something shifted in the room. The shadows in the corners of the office seemed to grow darker, longer. I could feel them closing in on me. I had to get out. But when I turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. And I realized something horrifying. This wasn't just about the park anymore. It was about survival. And there was no escaping. Not anymore. I barely slept that night. The rules, the whispers, the shadows, they were all in my head. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. And the more I tried to ignore the park's pull, the stronger it became. Every day, the rules seemed more like threats than guidelines. Every action, every decision felt like it would lead me deeper into its grip. It was like walking on a razor's edge, knowing the slightest misstep would send me over. I'd learned that much, at least. The park was testing me, testing all of us. The next evening after my shift, I decided to go to the maintenance shed. Maybe being away from the attractions would help clear my mind. The shed was old, really old, and the rusty tools in there had a kind of menacing aura. Something about them felt wrong, like they were watching me. As I picked up a wrench to check it, I heard a noise from outside. I froze. There it was again, that same soft, shuffling sound I'd heard before. Footsteps. But when I looked through the small window, all I saw was the empty path leading to the entrance. I shook my head. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, closer this time, right outside the door. A voice, low and raspy, calling my name. "James! James!" I couldn't ignore it anymore. I opened the door and stepped out. The moonlight cast long shadows on the ground, but there was no one there. Just the wind rustling through the trees, making the night feel even colder. And that's when I remembered Rule 7. Rule 7, never answer when the park calls you. I had broken it. I'd heard the voice, and I'd responded by opening the door, stepping out into the dark. And that's when I saw it, just beyond the fence, barely visible in the dim light. A figure, not quite human, but not quite anything else either. It had a twisted, misshapen body, its arms unnaturally long, and its eyes, they weren't eyes at all. They were holes, black and deep, like they led to nowhere. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Something about it felt familiar, like I had seen it before, somewhere deep in my nightmares. The figure reached out a hand toward me. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, into my very bones. It whispered my name again, but this time I didn't answer. I didn't dare. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't take my eyes off the figure. It was still there, just standing in the darkness, watching. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The terror in my chest was enough. That's when the park itself seemed to answer, like it was laughing at me. The lights flickered on, brighter than they'd ever been, illuminating everything around me. And the figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't really gone. It would never be gone. It was just waiting for the next time I would break another rule. I was losing my grip on reality. The nights were becoming more intense. The park, the shadows, the rules, it all blurred together in a way that made everything feel inevitable. I had already lost track of time. It felt like days, but it could have been hours. Every night felt the same. Every shift. The same walk through the park, the same warnings, the same shadows following me. Rick was right. The park gets to you. It's like it feeds on your fear, your confusion. The longer you stay, the harder it is to remember who you were before. The longer you stay, the harder it is to remember what life was like outside those gates. And then there was the mirror. I don't know why, but that mirror in the back room of the maintenance shed started to call to me. It wasn't part of the park's usual decor. It was just an old, cracked mirror that no one paid attention to. But somehow it felt different. Every time I passed by, it seemed to shimmer, pulling me in. I finally gave in. I had to see what was there. As soon as I stood in front of it, I felt the chill. A cold, unnatural chill that made my teeth rattle. The reflection in the glass wasn't me. Not completely. The man staring back at me was me, but there was something wrong about him. His eyes were wide, almost desperate, as though he was trying to scream but couldn't. He looked like he was reaching for something just out of reach. I backed away quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I remembered Rule 8. Rule 8. Never look into the mirror when the park is calling. It hit me then. The reflection wasn't just a reflection. It was another part of the cycle. Another soul trapped in the park. I had seen the same desperation in Rick's eyes just before he disappeared. I ran out of the shed, but the park wasn't done with me. It wasn't going to let me leave. The rules had already set their course. I had crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. The days, or what I thought were days, blurred together. The lines between reality and nightmare were thinning. There were nights when I didn't even know if I was awake or still dreaming. The park had become my prison, and I was trapped in it, bound by its rules and its thirst for fear. But tonight felt different. It wasn't like the other nights. The air was thick, heavy, like the park was holding its breath, waiting for something. I could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The whispers were louder tonight. They were inside my head, urging me to follow them, to find what had been hidden for so long. I walked through the park, my heart racing, knowing that whatever was coming would change everything. That's when I heard it, the same voice that had whispered my name before. It wasn't coming from outside this time. It was inside me, echoing in my mind. James, it's time. I stopped in my tracks. It was then that I realized the truth. The park wasn't just calling me. It was feeding off me. I had become part of it. Every rule I broke, every moment of fear, had been a step deeper into its grasp. That's when I remembered Rule 9. Rule 9. Never let the park speak to you. The moment you hear it, you're already lost. I had let the park speak to me. I had listened, and now I could feel it. Its presence was inside me, wrapping around my soul, suffocating me. The shadows around me grew darker, closing in. The lights flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows that moved with a life of their own. I could see shapes moving in the darkness, but they were not human. And then I saw it. At the far end of the park, behind the gate that led to the restricted area, stood a figure. A man, or at least it looked like a man. But there was something off about him. His body was too tall, too thin, his movements jerky and unnatural. The closer I got, the more I realized the truth. The figure wasn't a man at all. It was a puppet, controlled by something else. Something darker. As I approached, the figure turned to face me. And then for the first time, I saw its face. It was an old, twisted version of my own. The same eyes, the same mouth, but distorted and grotesque. "Welcome home, James," it said, its voice an echo of my own. "You've finally become part of us." And in that moment, I understood. The park didn't just trap people. It twisted them, turned them into something else. I had been slowly transforming into one of the park's creatures, just like everyone else who had crossed its path. I had made a mistake. I had ignored the signs, the warnings, and now I was paying the price. The park had taken me. It had turned me into something that wasn't human anymore. The fear had twisted me, shaped me into a puppet, just like all the others. I could feel the darkness pulling at me, wrapping itself around my body, taking control of me. But then I remembered the last rule. The one I had never paid attention to. The one that had been the key all along. Rule 10. If you ever find yourself at the gates, never look back. Once you do, you're part of the park forever. I stood at the gates now, knowing that it was my only chance. I had to escape. I had to leave before the park fully took me. But the darkness was closing in. The voices were getting louder. The creatures were everywhere, their eyes glowing in the shadows. I was running out of time. I turned, ready to face whatever was behind me, and that's when I saw it. The exit. The gate was open, and the night air was waiting. The park was no longer trying to stop me. It had let me go. But as I stepped through the gate, I heard the voice again. "You can't leave, James." I froze. The figure from the park was standing in front of me, its distorted face twisted into a smile. "You're ours now," it said. And I knew it was true. I had already crossed the line. There was no leaving the park. No escape. I had looked back. And that was the last mistake I would ever make. The gates slammed shut behind me, and I was swallowed by the darkness. Forever. If you ever find yourself in a job where rules like these exist, run. Don't stay. Don't even think about breaking them. Because once you do, the park doesn't just own you, it consumes you. And once it has you, there's no getting out. You'll become part of the nightmare, forever lost in its twisted halls. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more chilling tales.